Dear students, what we are going to do now is massive open online course on Indian Economy 1. The unit is Unit 1, Economic Development Since Independence. The module is Module 14, Growth and Development Under Different Policy Regimes. So what we are going to do here, what are the learning objectives? As you would see that we started the planning process in 1950 and we got independence in 1947. And if you trace out the growth process since 1947 or 1950 to be precise, then it's a growth process which is over the long term. And in this module, you will be able to understand the low initial phases of growth, its anatomy. The second will be the higher growth phase, which is service-led growth. And then we will try to link up this growth process with the reforms process, whether reforms have led to the growth or it has not led to the growth. Now, what is the plan of discussion? The plan of discussion is that we introduce the problem, then we talk about different phases in policy making from import substitution to reforms, and then we talk about how economic growth performed under different policy regimes, and finally we conclude. The planning process, as we have done under Module 7, you saw that in the planning process, resources were limited to start with, and that's why we started planning in India. And these resources were allocated uniformly across sectors. These resources were distributed uniformly across sectors. And in the process of planning, we initially focused on balanced growth between industry and agriculture. And finally, from the second plan onwards, it was industrialization which was given focus. Industrialization since 1956-57 was done under the rubric of import substitution. And during the years, over the years, we went on with import substitution in India. And finally, we realized that there is a need for liberalizing the economy. There is a need for reforms in the economy, and we liberalized the economy and reformed it. Now, then when did the reforms actually start? And there was a great debate that the reforms started in 1991, but to me, the process of reform started in the 1980s. To be precise, in 1980-81, when we started moving away from the import substitution-led industrialization process. Now, we would see that in 1980-81, the industrial economy started with delicensing. And if we recapitulate, then we would see that after delicensing, along with delicensing, actually, there was removal of capacity limits. The minimum efficient scales of individual industries were recalculated, and the industrial sector was thereby given a boost. To follow the industrial sector process, reforms or liberalization process, the trade reforms came in. Along with trade reforms, in the trade reforms process, actually what happened, there was removal of quantitative restrictions, and the quantitative restrictions were removed mostly on industries which were erstwhile protected, that is the capital goods industries and intermediate goods industries, so that the economy actually imports goods, capital goods, intermediates from the rest of the world and brings those imported inputs into the production process. The consumer goods were protected for a long time thereafter. Now, in 1991, the reforms were made more comprehensive. The reforms would then started actually taking into account making the economy from high-cost economy to a low-cost economy. The tariff rates, which were otherwise very high during the period from mid-80s onwards, they were gradually brought down. Other non-tariff barriers in the economy, mostly on the industrial sector, they were also brought down. From the early 90s, actually the reforms process, it was an unilateral liberalization or reform process. The reform process actually started bringing down the tariff on the one hand. On the other hand, foreign investment by investors from the rest of the world, foreign investments were allowed, and the economy started depending on foreign investment along with domestic private sector investment. So it not only looked into the industrial sector reforms, it also looked into the process of reforms, looked into the trade sector reforms. Along with trade sector reforms, it was foreign investment reforms. Other reforms were ushered in, public sector or public finance reforms were brought in. I am not going into the detail of that process. Now, the thing is, the reform process, which started as an unilateral reform process, became a multilateral reform process from the mid-1990s onwards, with the establishment of WTO and India signing the WTO agreement. And as a result of which, the reform process was strengthened, reform started moving at a faster pace. Reform started moving at a faster pace. Now, in 2000, 2001, the consumer goods sector, which was otherwise protected, that was also opened up, and the whole commodity producing sector was brought under an open regime. Thereafter, the agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, they were, over the period, the tariff rates and other associated reforms were brought in. From 2000 onwards, we would see actually there is increasing reforms of the services sector. So you would see, to start with, we protected industrial sector, then we started reforming the industrial sector, and once the industrial sector and agricultural sectors were reformed, then the service sector reforms started, largely from 2000, from the decade of the 2000s. You would see, along with reforms or along with policy changes, you would see that there are different phases of growth in the Indian economy. And by growth, what we are going to look into, though growth is a long-term process, but we would look at the annual percentage change in GDP. Often people talk about per capita GDP. Often people talk about per capita GDP and growth in per capita GDP, which is more an inclusive term. But here we would restrict ourselves to growth rate of GDP and growth in associated sectors, the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary sector. And the natural question that comes, if we have different phases of growth over the period, it cannot be or why we say that there are different phases of growth, because the growth had not been secularly increasing or secularly decreasing. There are fluctuations in growth over the period of time, and what has happened that there is a natural question whether such fluctuations or such phases of growth, if I am permitted to say that if fluctuations are there for a prolonged period of time, there can be phases, if such phases of growth can be linked to the reforms or not. So this is the objective with which this lecture is set in. Now, if you look at India's growth performance from 1950-51 onwards till 22-23, the last few years, the data for the last few years, it's either revised for the third time or they are partially revised, and that for 22-23, it's an advance estimate for that year. Now, here we have taken GDP at constant prices. Now, the government of India also brings out gross national income. We could have used that, or the net national product or net national income after taking into account depreciation. But we have thought that we should take GDP at factor cost at constant prices. It's 20, and the base year for this whole exercise is 2011-2012. Now, if you look at the graph, there's a blue line and a red line. The blue line measures GDP at constant prices, and if you see from 1950-51 till 2022-23, you will see that from 50-51 till the late 70s, it's almost flat, and then it has started slightly moving up. And then the rate of increase, the improvement is moderate in the blue line. The increase in the blue line is moderate, and then it sharpens after 2004-2005. But as we reach 2016-17 or little earlier, you would see that the growth, the GDP has not become flat, but it is almost at the same level. In some years it has gone down, in some years it has gone up. The red line, which is measured on the secondary axis, tells you about the rates of growth or annual percentage change in GDP at constant prices. And you would see that the average rate of growth till 79-80 was low. The average rate of growth hovered around 3.5 or 3.2 to 4% on the average, with very wide fluctuations. In years, you would see that they have gone down very sharply, and in some years, they have gone up quite sharply. And so, there are wide fluctuations. The amplitude, which we call in economic parlance as amplitude, the amplitude of fluctuations till 1978, 79, 80 is quite wide. And you would see post-1980, the amplitude of fluctuation has actually come down. If you compare this period with the later on, you would see the amplitude in the growth is still fluctuating, but the amplitude of fluctuation has come down. And the amplitude of fluctuation has even more come down after 1991. So you would see whenever the fluctuations are larger, if you average the fluctuations, if you average the growth rates, you would get a lower growth rate. Where fluctuations are bigger, smaller, if you average for that period, the average growth rate will be small. So As a result, if we do an econometric exercise, and many people, many commentators have done, one would see that there is a break in the growth rate or in the GDP trend in 78, 79 or 79, 80, end of 80s. And then there was a higher rate of growth. And the growth rate accelerated after 91, 92. Now, in the first phase of growth, which is a low phase, a phase with low rate of growth, there the growth rate averaged around, as I said, 3.5 to 4%. This low rate of growth, many people ascribed, many commentators, especially from the Delhi School of Economics in those days, they ascribed it as the Hindu rate of growth. I don't want to get into that argument of why it's called Hindu rate of growth, because recently, if you have seen the news headlines, there were controversy regarding why it was called the Hindu rate of growth. Even if we say that it's not the Hindu rate of growth, and I would go by that, then you would say that is a phase of low growth. From 3.5% to 4%, in the post-80s period, the average growth rate was above 5, it's 5.6%. And it further increased in the period after 1991. And you would see that in many years after 1991, and especially during 2000 to 2001 to 2007-8, you would see in many years the growth rate touched above 8%, almost closer to a double digit. So, and for a couple of years, the high rate of growth stayed on. So there was more stability in the rate of growth in the economy during that period of time. Now, so we can ascribe, whether we can ascribe these phases of growth into phases of growth with reforms or the changing policy regimes. Before we do that, let us take a closer look. Let us take a closer look at the growth rates of the economy since 1991, because we saw in 1991 there was higher rate of growth. And if you see, the rate of growth touched almost 8% in 97-98, and then above 8% in 2000-2001. It slowed down thereafter, as the blue line would show, and then it maintained at 8% during 2003 to 2008-9, and then it started fluctuating. But again in 2010-11, there was a spurt in growth, only to slow down thereafter. And as often commentators have said, that the growth rate has slowed down especially after 2016 and 17, and not to revive thereafter. Now, along with the rate of growth of the overall economy, what emerged important is the services sector. Even though we did not focus on the services sector with regards to policy. The policy always emphasized on the industrial growth, on industrialization in the economy to start with, and it was carried on. Now, what had happened from the late 70s onwards, and many commentators have shown, from the late 70s onwards, actually the service sector has emerged strong, precisely from 78, 79, and that preceded reforms, that preceded higher overall growth in the economy. So often, commentators have said that post 78-79 growth, or growth in the 80s, and especially growth in the 90s, whether it has been a service sector led growth. To bring out this point, let me look at what is the contribution or what is the sectoral share of the services in the Indian economy. And if you see that the services sector, which was less than 50% of total GDP in 91-92, it has crossed the 60% bar in 1917-18, and it is even up thereafter. Within the services sector, what has emerged important is, we said service sector production has emerged important, but along with service sector production, what we see that from the 2000s, there has been a spurt in service sector exports. Service sector exports were low. It was low till 1990-91 when it started emerging, but still the growth rates were not very high. And if you look at from 2001 onwards, service sector growth, export growth has increased. Service sector started climbing up, exports started climbing up. And there is if we do a structural break test, the structural break test will show that 2004-05 is a year of the structural break, that when service sector exports have started emerging stronger. Now, if we go back to the picture, then the long-term rate of growth, we saw a phase of low growth, we saw a phase of moderate growth, 5.6%, and even a stronger growth after 1991-92 in the 2000s. Now, can we link it to the reforms process? Maybe or may not be, because the turnaround in growth in the Indian economy happened before the liberalization process in 1980 started. The reforms process could have facilitated higher growth, and it maintained that higher growth in the 80s. And when reforms became comprehensive after 1991 or even after 2000, when service sector reforms had come in, growth had become stronger. But this process of growth, despite reforms, despite service sector reforms, despite emphasis on industrialization, make in India, and many other things, despite all that, the growth rate could not be sustained after 2016-17, and there has been a long phase of low growth. To conclude, India has moved from a low phase of low growth to a phase of high growth. This can be linked with policy regimes. Protective regimes or under protection rates of growth were necessarily low. But to start with, in the 50s, with protection, we saw phases or years of high manufacturing growth, but that could not be sustained. Thereafter, the process of slowdown went on till late 70s. The turnaround in growth did not necessarily happen with policy changes. It preceded the policy changes. And the turnaround in growth in 78-79 was not reforms-led. It was service sector-led, and service sector reforms were not therein. Only banking and insurance and many other services were nationalized in the 68-69, and they took time to gain grounds, and that pushed the economy towards higher levels of growth. Now, and more so, we would like to say that even if policy reforms are there or had been undertaken, the growth rates could not be sustained. What had happened in the meantime? As resources were released during reforms, as the regimes became more open, the growth rates were more stable during reforms, but the growth rates could not be sustained despite reforms. Now, what is more important is growth is accompanied by structural changes towards services. What became important is the service sector, and there has been emergence of new services. It's not traditionally that public administration and defense or railways, but there has been emergence of new services, business services, IT and IT-enabled services, other financial services, real estate as a service, hotels and restaurants, communication services, all these have emerged important in the economy. Further, this process of growth that we saw and tried to link with the policy regime, it's not inclusive in nature. Despite reforms, there has been rising inequality in the economy. Thank you.